Hello, everybody, and hello, everybody, and welcome to the Snakening Part 4. I got some nice AI generated art that I think kind of sums up the situation. And I have a big show for you guys today. I initially didn't have that much. I was just going to do a general update, but a lot of stuff has happened in the last 24 hours, and we're just going to start going through it and yeah, trying to resolve some of this. But like I said, it's been really busy. Let me know if anyone is having any kind of sound or other problems, and we'll try to correct that. So, firstly, I just wanted to talk about how the war is going in general. So, I've been very hesitant, um, at least since last winter, to offer any kind of timelines of when I thought things would happen. Like, I was very hesitant to say that this war was going to end at a specified time, that X was going to happen or Y was going to happen, or we're in like the end game. I tried very hard to keep it to relative, like if something's going well for one side or something's going poor for another side. And I even called it Schrodinger's war. The last time I made a time prediction was I thought that Russia's war effort was going to collapse if they didn't succeed in a large offensive by the end of last winter. Now, that obviously wasn't the case, and I was 100% wrong about that. But since then, I've been very reluctant to give any kind of time estimates. I'm going to give you some now, and we'll see if I'm right or wrong. I personally initially thought before the October thing that this war was going to end in about the summer of 2025 is when I thought that this would be concluded by. Um, uh, that's when I thought that this would probably have been over by. Now I'm moving it up, so I think because of the Israel situation, I think by the end of the year, Avdiivka will fall, and I think we might actually be entering the end phase now. Assuming Russia launches a winter offensive, which it looks like they're in the early phases of, I expect they will be in serious negotiations by the summer. Is kind of where I am now. I don't know. I kind of doubt that the Ukrainian army is just going to collapse altogether. But given current trends, given where things are at the moment, my guess would be they will start negotiating on unfavorable terms sometime before summer of next year. Um, Simply put, Ukraine went through the last of its strategic reserves in the big counteroffensive without achieving anything. I think Ukraine has, yes, they got a couple spots, but they have no way of exploiting that. They burned through the remaining strategic reserves. I don't think they have the ability to launch major offensives anymore. We still see some infiltration by infantry squads, and they can occasionally grab some territory, but I really don't think they can do another major offensive at this point in time. Unless they're just going to go back to scraping the bottom of the barrel and getting whatever the last couple tanks they have left. If they do another offensive, though, I think they won't even have the ability to defend themselves at that point in time. So, I think we are heading into the death spiral, as it were. And I think that's largely based on the fact that American money isn't coming. So we discussed this in a previous video where I determined that about that the US basically provides, I think it's something like the entire Ukrainian state budget. It was between half and all of it. So Ukraine has just kind of lost. It's the numbers are not exact in my head, but roughly we'll say the Ukrainian state has lost about 50% of its income, given the current crisis in Washington. Who knows whether or not they will actually be able to get any kind of funding done. I haven't heard the latest news. If anybody's heard anything about what if there's a deal with Biden over Ukraine funding and the what's going on in the border wall, let me know. But from my understanding, it's not it's not going anywhere at the moment. By the time it does get reauthorized, we're going to be months behind schedule, and that aid is going to be however long it took. The aid is going to how like if it's delayed like 3 months, that means they'll start sending the aid 3 months late. It doesn't mean like the day they get the bill passed, it's going to be sent there. It means that's when they start sending it unless Biden already has it working or they figured out some other way to give them weapons, which they did with the ATACMs. But there's that. There's also basically Ukraine was out of reserves of a lot of stuff, most notably artillery shells. And they're more or less relying on what the US and Europe can provide them on a monthly basis. Now, a lot of that is now going to Israel. The thing is, Ukraine was never going to completely run out of money, ammunition, I should say. The idea was that they were going to continue to get a trickle of it from the West, but that they wouldn't have the amount of artillery they needed. Like during the counteroffensive, there were times when they were firing more shells than the Russians, particularly on a local level, because they just went through their entire reserves. Um, but let's go through this because we have some pretty shocking admissions that we're going to discuss. This is just kind of a warm up, but we have like one of the most doomer things I've ever seen from the Wall Street Journal and the I forget what it's called. We'll look at it. Spectator, I think. Okay, so this is our warm up article. Imagine there may be no help. Conclusions of U.S. Special Representative to Ukraine. Penny Pritzker, aka Penny Pincher, U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine's recovery, has suggested that officials imagine how Ukraine could survive economically without U.S. aid during her first visit to Ukraine. Yeah, that's not a good sign. That's not what you want to have happen. You don't want on your first trip there um, them to say that. Yeah. Pritzky Pincher met with President Vladimir Zelensky, the Prime Minister and government officials, the chair of the Parliament, and American business. Um, in addition, she even attended a congress of regional authorities together with whoever head of the president's office. Okay, so let's see here. Petty tried to get people to think like, let's imagine there is no American aid. What do you need to do over the next year to make sure your economy can survive even in this situation? And it stressed everybody out. So I don't know. Maybe I'm being paranoid or I'm looking at things that aren't there. I think that's pretty scary if that's like one of the first things she's saying. It's inaccurate to say she had messages like there won't be any support. She said, imagine there isn't any support. That's very different. So that is kind of the warm up, and that is the attitude that they're taking. So we are going to start off with I could not find the Wall Street Journal version of this article is behind a paywall, and I couldn't figure out how to get past the paywall. So we're going to read the version of the article that's here. So this is from the Wall Street Journal. It's time to end magical thinking about Russia's defeat, which is not a good sign, especially when you have this like Putin giving a smug Pepe face. As Russian President Vladimir Putin looks towards the second anniversary of his all out assault on Ukraine, his self confidence is hard to miss. A much anticipated Ukrainian counteroffensive has not achieved the breakthrough that would give Kiev a strong hand to negotiate. Now, we're going to go through this very carefully because there's a lot to dissect here. Now, we noticed negotiation has started to be used. I'm not sure if everyone recalls, but for the longest time, we were told there would be no negotiation. There would be no agreement with Russia. We still have the Zelensky formula, I think it is, that negotiations cannot start until Russia pulls out from all Ukrainian territory, including Crimea. But this article is already kind of saying negotiation is a given at this point in time. They're also admitting that the counteroffensive failed, which is something I have not been um, seeing too much of. They've said it didn't live up to expectations, but they haven't said it's failed. Uh, Tumult in the Middle East dominates the headlines, and bipartisan support for Ukraine in the U.S. has been upended by polarization and dysfunction in Congress. Not to mention the pro-Putin leadings of Republican presidential frontrunner Donald Trump. Putin has reason to believe that time is on his side. At the front line, there are no indications that Russia is losing what has become a war of attrition. So we have a lot of big things to unpack in that sense. Um, Putin has reason to believe he has time on his side. Um, we were told for the longest time that the sanctions were going to destroy Russia's economy, and they refute that later in this article. They say the sanctions didn't work, but we were told America was gearing up. We're going to be outproducing Russia by 2025. We have all these other weapons. We're the new arsenal of democracy. We're just going to keep building it up. We have the F-16s are coming and all the other stuff. But now they're just saying, yeah, time's on Putin's side. At the front line, there are no indications that Russia is losing, which is kind of a backhanded compliment. It's saying, okay, well, there's not indications they're winning, but there's no indications that they're losing. Is I guess what they're kind of going for here. And they're admitting it's a war of attrition. Because for the longest time, they were saying that this was a war of territorial conquest, that whoever was taking and holding the most ground was the victor. And they were using that as a way to say Ukraine was actually winning the war because Ukraine had retaken all that ground in their offensive last year. But it's clearly not the case anymore. The Russian economy has been buffeted, but it is not in tatters. That's a big admission because I don't know if you all remember, like Russia was buying washing machines to take the chips out of washing machines was the narrative that we were sold for a while. Um, that like Russia couldn't produce any of this stuff domestically, that it was going to destroy Russia's economy. And personally, I thought it was. I actually thought that the sanctions were going to have a much bigger effect than they did. I thought that Russia was dependent upon certain high tech goods that it didn't manufacture, and without them, it would be devastating to their economy. But it seems like through a combination of increased domestic production, trading with non embargo countries, and getting around the sanctions by trading through third parties like Kazakhstan or Turkey, they're managing to get past the sanctions, and it hasn't severely hurt their economy, at least in the way that we thought. Putin's hold on power was paradoxically strengthened following Prigozhin's failed rebellion in June. Popular support for the war remains solid, and elite backing of Putin has not fractured. Yeah, and I said this at the time. Putin, not a single person supported Prigozhin. I think one officer in Wagner supported him. All the territorial, like governors, all the officials, all the military personnel sided with Putin during that almost immediately. The whole thing just kind of collapsed from lack of public support. So while it was deeply embarrassing and humiliating for Putin, I think it ended just about as bad as it could have. I mean, as good as it could have, given a coup attempt. That whole thing was a disaster, and I still have no idea what happened. Whether that was a coup, whether that was a march for justice, whether Prigozhin thought he was going to become like the new shogun, and or what. But I don't know. Western officials' promises of reinvigorating their own defense industries have collided with bureaucratic and supply chain bottlenecks. Meanwhile, sanctions and export controls have impeded Putin's war effort far less than expected. Russian defense factories are ramping up their output, and Soviet legacy factories are outperforming Western factories when it comes to much needed items like artillery shells. My understanding is they're also buying a substantial number of them from North Korea now. And I mean, once again, people can make fun of them from buying something from North Korea because North Korea is kind of a joke of a country in a lot of ways. But I mean, is there any scenario where you want less artillery shells? I mean, if you can have more artillery shells, then why not? Like if you're producing, I don't know, 2 million a month, and you can buy another 100,000 from North Korea, well, that's more you can fire. So why wouldn't you buy them? The technocrats responsible for running the Russian economy have proven themselves to be resilient, adaptable, and resourceful. Elevated oil prices, driven in part by close cooperation with Saudi Arabia, are refilling state coffers. Ukraine, by contrast, depends heavily on infusions of Western cash. Well, Ukraine has no economy other than basically foreign aid at this point. There's the grain deal didn't wind up going anywhere, so that's just not a thing. Putin can also look at his foreign policy record with satisfaction. His investments in key relationships have paid off. China and India have provided an important backstop for the Russian economy by ramping up imports of Russian oil and other commodities instead of fretting about lost markets in Western Europe or Beijing's reluctance to flout US and EU sanctions. Putin has decided it's more advantageous in the short term simply to become China's junior partner in the economic realm, which is probably true. To be honest, it probably is. But you know what? The Russian economy didn't collapse. They're gradually producing stuff there that they used to import from the West. So I guess if the choice was temporarily, hopefully temporarily, let China grab you by the balls, or just die, I guess that's like, I guess that's worth doing. I mean, who knows where this is going to go? Russia seems pretty determined to rebuild its economy and to not have to be less reliant on outside powers. But I mean, it's true. Like rather than crying about the sanctions from Western Europe, they just immediately just tried to go and trade elsewhere and went to other people and just sold their stuff other places. They took decisive action, and it looks like it largely paid off. Even neighboring countries that have every reason to fear Putin's aggressive tactics, such as Armenia, why does Armenia have to fear Russia's tactics? Armenia was an ally of Russia. Georgia, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan have made fat profits by serving as enablers of sanctions, circumvention, and as transshipment points for goods that Russia used to import directly. Is that spelt right? There's not a hyphen or a space or something there? Despite Putin's indictment by the International Criminal Court and the abundant evidence of Russian state sponsored war crimes in Ukraine, or should we say Israel war crimes in Palestine, he is still embraced in various parts of the so called global south. The Ukraine war holds little salience for many countries who bristle at what they perceive as US and European double standards or a lack of engagement on issues that concern them. I mean, a lot of them just don't really care. Also, it's kind of hard to do this narrative, especially now with Israel carpet bombing Gaza. Like, they're going, they have probably killed more civilians at this point than Russia has in Ukraine. Um, just going off of extrapolating from where the estimates were a week or two ago. The main thrust of let's see here. Putin signed off. I'm just trying to see here. Putin does not feel any pressure to end the war or worry about his ability to sustain it more or less indefinitely. As winter approaches, the Russian army has mounted a limited ground offensive of its own and surely will expand missile and drone attacks on Ukrainian cities, power plants, industrial sites, and other critical infrastructure. See, for the last year or so, particularly last winter, they've been trying to get rid of Ukraine's air defenses. So the theory was that they were hitting all the power plants last year because the idea they were attacking static targets that Ukraine would have to use interceptor missiles against as a way of basically just forcing them to get them down. At a minimum, Putin expects that US and European support for Ukraine will dissipate, that Ukrainians will tire of the endless terror and destruction inflicted on them, and that a combination of the two will enable him to dictate terms for a deal to end the war and claim victory. From his perspective, the ideal person to put such a deal together is Donald Trump if he returns to the White House in 2024, which is certainly a possibility at this point in time. The Russian leader is prepared to weaponize everything at its disposal to win the war in Ukraine. Nuclear arms control and European security are now hostage to Russia's insistence on the West ending its support for Ukraine. I mean, to like be fair, they like their insistence to do any business with Russia is dependent upon it ending its war in Ukraine. So true enough. I do agree though that the ending of the arms reduction treaties is scary. I did think that was I forget who it was, if it was Nixon or Ford or Reagan who really got the arms limitation treaties going. But that does scare me that we're not reducing the number of nuclear weapons anymore, and that whole thing just kind of failed. Let's see here. Taken together, this state of affairs poses an unprecedented challenge for Western leaders. Washington and its allies have been remarkably effective at tackling the most urgent problems of the situation, staving off Ukraine's collapse, keeping it well supplied. That is not true. With advanced weapons and real-time advanced intelligence, that is true, and devising sanctions against Russia, which they've already admitted didn't work. But now is the time to transition to a long term strategy that increases and sustains the pressure on the rogue regime in the Kremlin. There should be no illusions that any possible combination of short term steps will be sufficient to force Putin to abandon his war. I mean, isn't that kind of a admission of defeat at this point in time? I mean, that's kind of what it sounds like to me. I mean, they're basically stating that there's really nothing they can do at this point. Um, what Western leaders conspicuously haven't done is level with their publics about the enduring nature of the threat from an emboldened revisionist Russia. Now, I don't know if they misspelled that, if they mean revanchist Russia. I don't really know why revisionist would be the term. I think it would be revanchist or resurgent. Maybe the person who wrote this just screwed up their spell check. Maybe revisionism does have a term. Just when I think Russian revisionism, I think of Khrushchev, and I think of the post-Stalin era. They have indulged all too often in magical thinking, betting on sanctions, a successful Ukrainian counteroffensive, or the transfer of new types of weapon to force the Kremlin to come to the negotiating table, or they hope to see Putin overthrown in a palace coup. I'm sure this publication never said any of this stuff. I'm sure that the Wall Street Journal never said any of that stuff was going to happen, and that they've been 100% consistent in being realistic and not engaged in magical thinking this whole time. Okay, let's see here. A policy of containment would mean continuing Western sanctions, isolating Russia diplomatically, preventing the Kremlin from interfering in our own domestic politics, and strengthening NATO deterrence and defense capabilities. I mean, But you already said that the sanctions don't work. You already said that you didn't isolate Russia. That Russia has lots of friends in the world. People like them more than they like you guys. Um, yeah, so it's this non-answer. I mean, rebuilding the military industrial complex so that you can actually produce weapons again in significant quantities, that is a good idea. That is correct, and that is what they should be doing. But the sanctions they've already admitted didn't work. Europe is, let's see here. NATO's welcomed two new members, Finland and Sweden. Putin is reduced to knocking on doors in places like Beijing, Tehran, and Pyongyang. The proverbial correlation of forces has tilted decidedly against Russia. It's against them, guys. It's Russia's losing, but they're not losing. But I get what they're saying. They're saying that they believe in a war against NATO, that Russia would get blown out, which is probably true. I'm not even really going to dispute that. I really doubt that that Russia would be able to take NATO in an all out war at this point in time. That being said, um, it's a lot closer than I think it was because a lot of NATO members have basically disarmed themselves because they just have virtually no ammunition or missiles left. So even if they have better weapon systems, I just don't think they have them in enough. Like the UK's army has been reduced to almost nothing. Um, the Eastern European countries have given up all of their Soviet arsenals. Canada's given up most of its weaponry. Germany's given up large numbers of tanks, artillery shells, stuff like that. The US had to borrow shells from South Korea to try to keep this thing going. It's I'm sure that the US kept like its best weapons for itself, but at the end of the day, you have to have something to fire at your enemies. And if they burn through like their artillery and cluster bombs and they've sent a lot of Bradleys and Strikers and Leopards and Abrams and stuff like that over. I don't know. I don't think it's going to come down to a conventional war under any circumstances because both sides have nuclear weapons. And I think for the moment, neither side is insane enough to resort to atomics. I don't think Russia needs to go to war with Europe. I do think it's dangerous the way that like U.S. keeps saying that Russia's going to invade. Now, might Russia try to pull some Gisler ops in Moldova or the Baltic states or something like that and try to get them to leave the EU and join the Eurasian Union or the Union State? That's quite plausible, to be honest. But I just don't see the West being able to rebuild the military industrial complex in any significant amount of time. And Russia is still expanding its stuff. More important against all predictions, Ukraine has withstood the Russian onslaught. How is it against all predictions? You literally said earlier on that you predicted that the situation was going to go worse for Russia. So it's not against all predictions. It's I don't know. It doesn't make it. It's just countering the earlier part. In less than 2 years, the Ukrainian army has reduced an entire decade of Russian military modernization to dust. I mean, have they? We're seeing new Russian jets come out. They're producing large numbers of new and upgraded tanks. Um, we have the glide bomb, which has kind of been one of the most interesting weapons of the war. Russia's kind of revolutionized, well, both Russia and Ukraine have revolutionized drone warfare. I don't really think it has. I think it's shown that while there's some aspects of conventional warfare that still apply, how important things like precision guided munitions have become. And not so much even just precision guided munitions, but the ability to make massive quantities of them. That industrial warfare is still a thing. But I do think that the tide, at least from what I've been able to determine in this war, has turned against armored vehicles because drones are just too effective at taking them down. Because tanks don't have armor on their roofs. And people made fun of the Russians for putting like spaced armor on the roof of their tanks, and they called them cope cages. If you look at Israeli tanks, they have slat armor on the top of their tanks. It's there to prevent drone to like to cause drones to explode before they hit the tank. I mean, it's not rocket science. It's a pretty standard procedure. No less critical is helping Ukraine to navigate towards its rightful place in Europe. Um, so the EU announced that Ukraine has met 90% of the required. Let me find that because that was insane. Okay, so Ukraine has met well over 90% of the necessary reforms the EU set out last year for them to join the EU. What? So they're 90% ready to join the EU. Like, isn't the fact that it's in an active war a condition? Is that one of the 10%? Not being in an active war with a great power? Like, it boggles the mind that they would say that. Also, Moldova and Georgia are also going to join, which I'm pretty sure you can't have ongoing territorial disputes and join the EU. So, how is Georgia going to join the EU? How is Moldova going to join the EU? Also, Moldova and Georgia are like nowhere near developed enough to join the EU. That's not even like a political bias on my point. It just doesn't make any fucking sense. Like, can you imagine if Ukraine did join the EU? Let's pretend that somehow tomorrow they kicked Russia out and they joined the EU. The EU would be on the hook for rebuilding the entirety of Ukraine while it's going through a recession. That's insane. There's no fucking way that's going to happen. Um, Besides, someone's going to veto it. I think actually Germany has said that they're going to veto this. Um, uh, in spite of the invasion, they have come a long way and tried their very best to reform. It's really impressive. I mean, like, if we're going by the G slur standard of liberal democracy, okay, so if Hungary is a dictatorship according to the EU, if Poland under law and justice was a dictatorship, then Ukraine is a dictatorship. I mean, can we just be honest about that? Um, like, can we just be real here? I have not seen any real evidence that there's mass electoral fraud in Hungary. It just seems that people like Orban and they like his policies and he keeps winning elections. But like Hungary has nowhere near the level of political oppression against opposition parties that Ukraine does. Has Hungary banned like sects of Christianity? Maybe it has, and I'm just not noticing it. But I'm pretty sure censorship is way worse in Ukraine than it is in Hungary. And people kind of seem to misunderstand me whenever I talk about that. I don't really have an issue with it personally because if you're in a total war, yeah, you should shut down and suppress and take out opposition and sources of domestic um, uh, subversion. But my point is, the whole thing is being sold to us that Ukraine is this liberal democracy that's 90% ready to join the EU and that's completely reformed everything when it's a police state at the moment. And I do think it needs to be a police state. Like I don't begrudge Lincoln for what he did during the Civil War. If the country is falling apart, then yeah, if there's a time for emergency act, if there's a time to suspend civil rights, total war is probably a good time for that. Like not like the Patriot Act where like 9/11 was sad and all, but America wasn't in existential terror. No, but they do say Hungary is an autocracy because they don't like Orban, and he keeps winning elections. So like they've said that because Orban keeps winning elections with an overwhelming percentage of the vote, that's an indication that it's not a democratic country. Is what I've heard. Um, Russia is interesting. It depends how you define democracy. Russia is not a free country. Well, it depends how you define free country too. Um, if you want to define democracy purely as the will of the population, and that the person that most people want to be the leader of the country is the leader of the country, then yes, Russia is a democracy. I don't think there's any real doubt um, that the vast majority of the Russian population supports Putin. I don't think that's really even questioned by people who hate him and think that he's like the second coming of Hitler. So, does Russia have what we would consider free and fair elections? Probably not. But yeah, I'm saying no. I don't think that Hungary does. I'm just saying the EU has repeatedly stated, and other people have stated that Hungary is an authoritarian country, and it's not a free country um, by the standards of Europe. Okay, so let's see here. Let's get back to this. Maintaining cohesion and resolve among the Western allies will be essential for leaders on both sides of the Atlantic. Yeah, but that's gone because of Israel. Because America will do anything for Israel. America will, like, if America had to spend like 20% of its GDP to prop up Israel, they would. If America had to send like 1 million men to die in Iran because it would slightly improve Israel's position, they would. The American elites are psychotically pro Israel. For a lot of them, it is a matter of religious faith. Now, I'm exaggerating, but not by much. So, to them, like, you have one Jew in Kiev versus 8 million Jews in Jerusalem. So, guess who's gonna win? Uh, guess who's gonna get the money? We should be extremely cautious about giving any new leadership in the Kremlin the benefit of the doubt. Reagan needed a lot of convincing that he felt that Gorbachev was different from his Soviet predecessors. The challenge is vastly more difficult, given that whoever might replace Putin would have to um, end the war and engage with Kiev in genuine, serious negotiations. I mean, they talk about like regime change in Russia. It's quite possible that whoever succeeds Putin will either come from the far right or the far left. Because you have far right nationalists, liberal Democrats, I think Rodina, some other groups. And then you have the far left ultra nationalists like the Communist Party. So it probably would come from one of those, or maybe some other hardliner. It's like when we talk about Netanyahu resigning. Netanyahu isn't even on the right wing of his coalition. A lot of the other parties that he's in coalition with are way more radical than Likud is. Um, so just keep that in mind. Um, well, it depends. Okay, the Communist Party is, I guess, what we'd say maybe on economic issues they are. The Communist Party of the Russian Federation is basically a left wing nationalist party now, in that they tend to be socially conservative nationalists but have communist views on economics. So, but my point is, I could see a successor coming from that sort of area, like some sort of left wing, economically left wing nationalist. Russia under Putin has mostly a capitalist economy. It's really weird. Um, okay, so that was the first article that we had in question. Now we're going to look at the second article. So that I think was one of the biggest like I talk about the snakening as a joke, but I'm just gonna ask people in the chat: is that not them throwing Zelensky under the bus? Is that not them like saying that the war is lost, that they're completely fucked, and that there's really nothing they can do at this point in time? Like, what is the conclusion here? Like, they said we need more sanctions, which they admitted didn't work. They need to send more weapons to Ukraine, which they admit they don't have. It's just like that is a black pill. That is a black pill. We have Pepe Putin here. We have magical thinking. It's rough. It's really rough. So we have another article here. This is another one. This is from the Spectator, which I believe is a neoliberal Tory aligned paper in the UK. So we have a sad, pathetic Zelensky sitting here um, with a Z chair, just with nothing. So I don't entirely understand what that is. Happy New Year, the year of our victory, said Zelensky on January 1st, after the liberation of Kharkov and Kherson. Ukrainians entered the ninth year of the war with hope that they could win. Light will always prevail over darkness, Zelensky likes to say. But now the counteroffensive is nearly over, having made crushingly few gains. With Western support waning, Kiev needs to be honest about how the war is going and what it will take to turn the tide. I mean, there's a lot of admissions here. Um, the counteroffensive is near. Well, the counteroffensive is over. They're admitting it didn't make any gains. If you look at the New York Times article, which we looked at previously, that says that Ukraine made some gains. If you look at it, they actually lost territory during the counteroffensive. Um, Kiev will needs to be an honest about how the war is going and what it will take to turn the tide, but they can't. They can still launch some infantry assaults. They can still take some ground. They can still like there's some stuff that they can do, but they don't have. I don't think they have the strategic initiative anymore. I don't know if we've seen the. Let me see if I can find that because I think there is. They have started sending large numbers of women to the front lines. Like that could be fake news though, but uh, you know what? Let's take a slight detour. Let's look at a fun story or a more fun story for a moment, and then we'll get back to depression. Okay, Canada is so expensive that Ukrainian immigrants are leaving. High housing price costs and underemployment are challenges for the new arrivals. That's rough, man. I feel your pain. I know how you feel about the housing prices here. But I thought immigration was supposed to reduce costs. I thought immigration was supposed to make things cheaper. That's what I was told. Not long after Russia began bombing Ukraine, packed his bags and fled. Now war torn city, he moved to Stockholm and took a job as a line cook. The continental change in security. Okay, so 7 days a week in fast-paced kitchens. Can't uh, make his make his rent. Okay, I can't get past the paywall on this one. It sucks, but it seems like the Ukrainian refugees are finding they can't afford life in Canada. Now, as I've stated, I've always been for taking as many Ukrainian refugees as want to come here. I'm okay with taking in like half of Ukraine's population. Uh, if we're going to get some European Christian immigrants, then more power to them. I'll take that over what we normally get. Uh, I'll take any number of Ukrainians, to be perfectly honest. Just let them come. It's like when we took in all the Hungarians after the Hungarian Revolution. I thought that was a good idea then, and I think it's a good idea now. Let's see here. The strenuous work and high cost of living has taken its toll, planning a return to Sweden. His monthly expenses in Toronto include roughly $100 for a phone plan. That sounds about right. $150 for public transit, $400 for groceries, and $1,000 for a room in a rooming house. That's not bad. Where the kitchen and bathroom are shared among four tenants. Yeah, I guess that's about standard. Any money left over is sent back to his family still living in Ukraine. At least enough in Stockholm, he earned enough to have savings, he said. I'm tired of it all now. I want to go back to Europe because it's such a difficult life in Canada. Yeah, yeah, that's pretty accurate. They raised my rent this year, like I think 15 to 20% or something like that. To be honest, you're just hoping that Ukraine's sword girl shows up. I understand she's probably this. Well, I've thought about it. I've got to admit, part of me has thought maybe I should find a QT and like marry her. So then, who's like desperate to stay here, but she would probably be a gold digger, and it probably wouldn't turn out well. But the LARPy part of my brain has considered that. I'm not gonna lie to you guys because I'm an honest person. The country has welcomed nearly 200,000 Ukrainians since the war's outset. We should welcome more. But the daily grind of life um, in Canada's busiest metropolis, not just Toronto, but also Vancouver, Montreal, and Calgary, along with soaring costs, is making it increasingly hard to get by. Why do they always go to like the most expensive, cost and effective places in Canada? Like, why? Like obviously Canadian citizens can't afford Vancouver. You can't afford to live in Vancouver with like an 80, $90,000 salary. Like people don't really get. People talk about Tokyo. Housing is much cheaper in Tokyo than it is in Canada. Okay, sorry. I'm sorry, guys. I'll clip this part out when we do this, but I just have to rant about this for a second. Like people don't get what it's like in Canada compared to the rest of the world. So like housing prices in Canada are much higher than they are in like the rest of the world. Um, like you can see this right here. Like housing prices in Canada have skyrocketed. People don't really get it, but well, yeah, like Japan, housing prices in Japan are not that expensive because I don't think the Japanese really have any zoning laws. They just let people do whatever they want. Also, Japan doesn't have rapid population growth in its urban centers from immigration. So yeah, that's how housing prices have changed over time, and that is how U.S. versus Canadian housing prices have diverged. Um, Real housing prices. Where's rent? There's rent here. Yeah. So Dead House. I'm in the Maritimes, and this country is fucked. It doesn't even look like the place I grew in anymore. I feel like a foreigner in my own city. It's been flooded with immigrants. Yeah. So I think it says something if people are saying that Canada is so bad, they're going to go back to Europe. Now, he's not going back to Ukraine, but he's saying that he's going to go back to Europe and try to figure something else in Sweden. He's saying that Sweden is cheap by comparison, which is not something you hear too often. Okay, so let's see here. I apologize for that digression. I will edit that out if people want me to edit it out. Let's see here. After Zelensky, the most popular figure in Ukraine is Zelensky, commander in chief of the military, and he has a very different message. Fighting has hit a stalemate, he told The Economist. A beautiful breakthrough is not imminent, and Ukraine should prepare for a long trench war requiring huge resources to make small gains. Weapons do arrive, but too few and too late. The long range missiles and tanks being received now would have been useful last year. When Ukraine innovates, it did it with swarming drones. Russia simply copies, but at scale. Without a game changer, as Illusiony wrote, and without acquiring some new technological advantage, Ukraine won't be able to win. So once again, we have been hearing for like months for this whole conflict that Russia was out of ammunition, Russia was being outproduced, their army was on its last legs, it had no manpower. So it does look like they just lied to everybody. And I mean, you can say what you will about the conflict. I don't care if you're pro Ukraine. I don't if you I don't care if you support Ukraine, if you support Russia, if you support Israel, if you support the United States. The objective fact is that Western governments lied to their population and lied horrendously about how the war was going and led them along the garden path and said everything was good and we have to indefinitely support this war in Ukraine and Ukraine's winning and all this other stuff. And I think, regardless of whether you think it was a good idea to fund Ukraine or not, I think the people in the like in Europe and Canada and America deserve to know what was actually happening, and they deserve to have to like be told this is how the situation is. This is what it's going to cost us. Instead, they didn't. Instead, they were lied to. They were gaslit. They were told all this stuff, and now it's just dropping on them like a fucking hammer. And when I call this the snakening, once again, part of it is humor, but another part of it is, yeah, they did promise Zelensky all this stuff. They promised Ukraine all this stuff. They like Ukraine was going to basically surrender in February of last year during the Minsk agreement. But Boris Johnson came in and said, no, don't do it. We're going to give you everything. You're going to win the war. So they lied to him too. So people say politicians lie all the time. But as a man, as a leader, as a prince, all you have is your word. All you have is the trust of the people. And if you're going to just lie like this and lie so flagrantly, then yeah. I'm just going to read a comment quickly. If it wasn't for the laptop class in Toronto, Trudeau would never have become bread lord. But Harper didn't apprentice a new leader to win his final election. Yeah, it's true. Harper did not have a designated successor, which is part of the problem. Now, as I've said, I've moved to Winnipeg, which is cheaper than Toronto, but even here it's starting to get expensive. It's not like it was like a decade or two ago. And grocery prices are astronomical. I was at Dairy Queen the other day because I wanted to try out their sugar cookie blizzard, and like a medium blizzard is now like $8.50 or something like that. Yes, I mentioned I understand that Ukraine got a foothold on the left bank of the Dnieper near Kherson. I referenced that a couple times. With this bombshell, he overturned Zelensky's policy of sharing only positive narratives. The Ukrainian president's optimism has always been partly tactical. If the West thinks that Ukraine does not stand a chance, he thinks his allies may push him into peace negotiations. Ukrainians know from bitter experience, including the Minsk agreements, what peace with Russia means. It means Moscow has more time to prepare for the next invasion. I guess, but Ukraine would also have time to prepare. You would also have time to get like the I think like a vanilla dip cone dipped in chocolate is like $6 or $7. It's insane. It's insane. He also emphasized what to do about okay. So we also have the sunk cost fallacy that's going on. Sorry, just maybe to address it directly. So Fritz has been saying in the chat that Ukraine got a foothold on the left bank of the Dnieper near Kherson. Now, I do. I have heard that, and I am aware of that. And yes, Ukraine has managed to take what appears to be a foothold on the Russian side of the Dnieper. The problem is, I don't think they have the resources to do anything with that. I think they've maybe taken it, they can maybe hold it for a little while, but I don't really know how they're going to expand. And as time goes on, Russia is going to bring more and more troops in. They're going to fire glide bombs. They're going to fire artillery. It's not that hard to take some ground during a war. You have a massive front line, and there's always the opportunity of just running some dudes through open terrain and capturing it. But that's not. I don't think it's sustainable. So, did Ukraine take some territory on the Russian side of the Dnieper? Yes. Are they going to hold it for a while? Probably. Is it going to allow them to do any sort of significant offensive? I don't think so. I also don't know if they can really get armored vehicles across in significant numbers. But Zelensky here has become the victim of the hype over the counteroffensive. Too many people expected a breakthrough when the winter ended and the fighting began. I'm sure the Spectator in no way played into that. I'm sure the Spectator didn't tell people that there was going to be a breakthrough. Like all the Western media said this. All the Western media just said, "Oh, we're gonna break through to Crimea. The Putin regime is gonna collapse." That kind of thing. I could be wrong. Ukraine. This might be a big victory for Ukraine. I'm just being. That's my opinion on the matter. I'm not denying the facts that Ukraine successfully landed on the Russian side of the Dnieper. Okay, so after 5 bloody months of fighting, Ukraine has only advanced 10 miles. Um, so expectations have turned to disillusion, dangerous for a president whose strategy is to keep the dream alive at all costs. Zelensky is dependent on his charisma and his ability to turn a phrase. His much quoted line, "I need ammo, not a ride," stood in the tradition of the finest war leaders and rallied the democratic world to Ukraine's defense. Optimism is one thing, but a refusal to face hard facts is quite another and a dangerous one. Zelensky needs to tell Ukrainians that there is a shortage of soldiers on the front line and that mass conscription is urgently needed. But how can he reconcile this with the official message that victory is just around the corner? Well, he can't. What is emerging between the soldiers on the front line who know how bad things are and civilians in the cities who believe that 700,000 people have been drafted since last February are sufficient to win in some meaningful sense. I spent time on both sides of the divide earlier this year and saw the perception gap myself. The soldiers I talked to in Donetsk region told me that their brigades were so understaffed they were not allowed to go home. Some had been in the battlefield for 18 to 20 months. Others had spent more time at war than at home since 2014. Calling for demobilization after 18 months of service. Like Ukraine's out of manpower. I don't see how that's really arguable anymore. Um, so the front line will need new enforcements, but that will include having a frank conversation with the public about the true state of the war. Also, keep in mind that drafting people doesn't really help in this situation. They aren't going to have time to adequately train any of these people. They're basically going to take civilian. Now, this is not me talking. Okay, let me see if I can find that. Um, yeah, according to the BBC, and this was last year actually. Okay, so things were way worse than even back then. So this is a BBC article, well known to be a far right pro Russia show publication. Um, tra- Teenagers were given 3 days of training before being sent to the front line. Where is the other one? Uh, Conscripts will get about 17 days of instruction. Um, so I saw another article. Okay, new teenage recruits. This is another article. Okay, that's on the same topic. I do remember though that there was an article. I did cover it a couple days back, a couple videos back, that they had just started throwing in people. Maybe it was that one. Maybe it was from last year. I think there was another one though. But the point is, they're basically, let's see how long U.S. basic training is. Okay, so basic training in the U.S. Army is 2.5 months, and even then, that is, I think that's before they learn some sort of specializations or something like that. Can last anywhere from 4 weeks to 7 months. It depends on what they're doing. Um, that's basic training. I doesn't. I think combat training takes longer. I could be wrong. If somebody knows how long it takes to get a soldier battle ready in the U.S. Army, post in the chat. But the point is, they have nowhere near the amount of time to properly train these dudes, and they're just sending them into the meat grind. It's fucked. Like it's fucked. I don't know what else to really say about it. It's tragic. Last month, a poll by Kiev Institute of Sociology showed that 80% believe that Ukraine should not give up any of its territories, including Crimea, even if it means to prolong the war. Um, Billboards and TV advertisements beg men to enlist, but why should anyone do so if Russia's defeated? People who think victory is certain want to plan for a future and for their children. They don't risk their lives. They don't want to risk their lives. Excuse me, sorry. So the Ukrainian authorities have two choices. They can keep going with the boosterism and persist in telling everyone the fighting is going according to plan, or they can start an honest conversation about what's actually happening. It's not just the Ukrainian authorities who avoid unpopular topics, but also the Western allies who crave the sight of heroic Ukrainian fighters making stunning advances rather than struggling for every trench. I mean, partially they stopped funding Ukraine because they weren't getting the same degree of media attention. And once again, like, I make fun of this. I call it the Ukraine cinematic universe. I talk about, like, but that's how these assholes view it. That's how these guys view it. Like, they'll tell Zelensky, you have to send your men into battle when they're almost certainly going to get fragged, because it has to make the 9 o'clock news. It's a very sick way of looking at the world. Um, let's see here. The West needs to be honest with Ukraine too. We in the West became victims of our own propaganda. We thought it would work. We have forgotten about the essence of war. Like, this is devastating. This is them basically admitting it's over. Um, Not necessarily that the war is over. The war, I think, is going to drag on probably until the summer, at least. But it's saying that there's no hope of winning at this point in time. The average age of a man in the Ukrainian armed forces is 40 years old. That's way too old. Although it's kind of funny because I remember there was a World War II documentary I was watching when I was growing up, and somebody said that the minimum age for soldiers should be 40 years old, because by that time in your life, the hormones have calmed down, and older dudes are less likely to go berserk than younger ones. But that's obviously not the case here. I just always thought that was an interesting statement. That was the deal, Kiev. And for Ukraine, Zelensky must talk frankly about the sacrifices that will be required to keep Russian forces at bay for another year. Ukrainians have shown their unity and resilience when they need to defend their homeland. The real question is the extent of the sacrifices everyone is willing to make, and what the most probable outcome will be if they choose not to pay the price anymore. And so the question is, and I did a video on this, and this is an ongoing question: is it honorable to fight to the very end when there's no hope of success? Was it honorable for Serbia to fight to the death in World War One and take horrific casualties when there was no real way they were ever going to stop Austria Hungary or Germany? And Serbia did one of the bravest things that any country I think has ever done in history in how hard they fought off the Central Powers. But in the end, it collapsed. You could argue, though, in that case, it was at least part of a grand strategy that it held up a lot of Central Powers troops. Um, the Austro-Hungarians got bogged down. The Germans had to divert troops from other fronts. Bulgaria couldn't do anything on other fronts. You could argue that them doing that prevented the Germans from winning elsewhere. So you could say, even if that was an immense sacrifice, it was a critical part in winning the Warda War. And so that is, but is resistance for resistance sake really the honorable way thing to do? Is it better to live on your knees than die on your feet in certain circumstances? The other thing you have to keep in mind, and this is kind of something that bothers me sometimes when it comes to Christian pacifism, is there's a difference between pacifism at an individual level and a national level. To be able to turn your other cheek, to forgive your enemies, to be able to accept that your death rather than resort to violence, there is some there is some grace of that on an individual level. But you don't get to make that decision for the rest of society, for countless women and children, and say that your society has to disarm and follow your pacifist philosophy. So, at what point does it just become pride? At what point does it just become a desire to resist no matter the cost because you can't admit you're wrong and you can't admit that you it's time for you to step down? Um, but I use Serbia as an example because I think it's an interesting case of when you could argue that resistance led to uh, a thing overall. France, however, and people keep shitting on France for World War II, and they call them cheese eating surrender monkeys. France had lost. The French front line had collapsed. The Germans had broken through. What would have been the point in fighting on when there was basically nothing they could do at that point? Britain had withdrawn from the continent. Britain was in no position to help them. So that, like, I think surrendering in that case was the correct decision. Um, what like I honestly don't know what else they were supposed to do. Just continue the war going and getting more people killed for no purpose. On the other hand, once again, you have was it dumb for Britain to remain in the war, despite the immense sacrifices the British people had to undergo? And I think you could make the case it was because they basically, in my opinion, Germany would have won the war on the Eastern Front had Britain pieced out of the war, because then Germany could have imported oil from Venezuela and Mexico and elsewhere, and they wouldn't have had the fuel shortage that um, yeah, Germany had all but guaranteed a sovereign France post-war. Yeah, but you get my point. Is sometimes it makes sense, but then you have LARP like the War of the Triple Alliance. I don't know if anyone remembers the War of the Triple Alliance, which is one of the single most insane things in human history. Which is just kind of a meme war. So Paraguay decided that it was going to go to war with Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay. Um, and it's estimated something like what was the percentage of the civilian population? Basically, Paraguay just did full deployment. It conscripted literally everybody that it could. Let's see here. Let me just try to find it. Paraguay. Some people argue that Paraguay um, lost up to 69% of its population, of which 90% were male. So, like, the entire male population basically got wiped out in the one war. Now, I think that's too high. I don't think that that's what happened. I think Population numbers post war is always difficult because a lot of people move. Record keeping isn't very good. People probably fled to other countries. But my point was that it was completely insane. And there was absolutely no way um, that he, uh, that yeah, was going to happen. That Paraguay was going to win that war. It was just a complete shit show. Um, so do you resist in that case? I mean, in that case, there's also the aspect that uh, the Paraguayans started the war because they thought that they were going to um, somehow be able to defeat like three large countries. Well, I guess Uruguay isn't that big, so maybe they could have taken Uruguay on, but Brazil and Argentina are both like almost are both major regional powers. So, what else was there? I'm trying to think. Maybe Japan was like even Japan was smart enough to surrender. They could have kept the war going. They could have forced America to like invade the home islands, but they're just like there's no point anymore. Um, and honestly, as I've said many times, I think it worked out pretty well for Japan. Japan was able to. I think you can say a lot of things about America, and I'm sure a lot of people disagree with me. Japan's pacifist constitution and some of the like G slur stuff that happened was partially America forcing it on them. A lot of it was just that people didn't want to go back to the 1930s. People didn't want to go back to the national mobilization to total war to rule by like a corrupt military oligarchy, and a lot of people just wanted pacifism and peace. And the Japanese liberals kind of gained ascendancy because uh, like the far right had been kind of discredited given how bad World War II went. I mean, to its credit, America could have destroyed Japan. They could have reduced it to like basically a slave camp. They could have burned everything to the ground even more than they did, but they largely rebuilt Japan, and Japan became a wealthy country, and they have good relations with America. It's kind of like what happened with Britain. Is ultimately, I think the American War of Independence worked out pretty well for Britain. They didn't have to pay for the colonies anymore, and they got a culturally similar English-speaking country that they could trade with. And they made a ton of money after it, and they had some rivalry, but ultimately it kind of worked out. My point being that at this point in time, Ukraine kind of has to just realize they have to basically just kind of give up now or keep going. Because something I've noticed is throughout the war, Russia's war goals keep expanding as the situation gradually shifts more and more in their favor and the costs of the war become greater and greater. The more Russian soldiers who die, the more likely they are to demand more of the country. It started off with just autonomy for Lukansk and I can never remember the other one's name. What the other Donbass republic was, but for them, then it went to then it went from there to uh, the oblast they annexed. Now they've started to talk about Odessa and Kharkov, and I saw something about taking everything but Galicia, retaking all the parts of Ukraine that belong to the Russian Empire. So I don't know. Do you just give up now and try to get the best deal you can? Donetsk. Thank you, Donetsk. I mean, the probably the best time would have been after Russia kind of started getting bogged down at the beginning, or after the successful counteroffensive last year. It tried to come to some agreement. Like they were always going to lose at least something, but it's sometimes you only get to decide how much you lose and how many people die. But so that is the part of the snakening. I hope people enjoyed it. Um, I sorry if it wasn't as humorous as some, but it's depressing. Like these dudes are just getting thrown under the bus. They're just being told, "Thanks, but no thanks, Ukraine. There's going to be no help for you. We promised you all this shit. You're not going to get any of it. Um, it's basically over for you." And it's rough. It's really rough, and I don't really know where we go from here at this point. So I think that's more or less the end. Does anyone have any questions or something they'd want me to read out in the chat before I end the stream? I've been getting a lot more big shout outs lately. Really? Who's been shouting me out? Um, let me know about that. By the way, I did put an anime video out. I'll try to get back to doing some more variety of content. Like, I'm sorry if I'm only been doing geopolitics and I've been covering it on like a day to day basis. But to be fair to me, stuff is kind of going crazy. It's like during COVID, I had to talk about COVID a bunch. I haven't really had the time to talk about Rent a Girlfriend season 3. I will talk about Rent a Girlfriend season 3 at some point because the simping reached new highs. We reached levels of simping that I didn't even think were possible in Rent a Girlfriend season 3. So, anyways, God bless everybody. Hopefully this will end soon one way or another and the destruction of the Ukrainian people will come to an end. But love you guys. Have a great weekend. Try to get some